Good evening. I am the Maven of the Eventide, and welcome to another vampire interview, which is not an interview with a vampire because you are not a vampire, right?
Supposedly, that's what I've been told.
Oh, don't get my hopes up. I'm here tonight with author Dacre Stoker, who's the author of several books, but notably these two books. This is Dracula the Undead by Dacre Stoker and Ian Holt, and Dracul by Dacre Stoker and J.D. Barker. Now, this is the officially sanctioned sequel to Dracula. And why is it officially sanctioned?
Well, there actually are direct descendants of Bram Stoker still alive, my cousins. And they were quite interested when I approached them and said, nobody in the family has really gotten involved in this whole thing. How about, I do some research. I've been contacted by this fellow Ian Holt, who's a screenwriter, and would you mind making this an official endorsed sequel by the Bram Stoker estate? And they liked the story. They found it a little bit gory, but they liked the idea that somebody in the family was continuing the legacy of Bram Stoker.
And now you manage the Bram Stoker estate, don't you?
Yes, they are not very sharp in things like trademark and licensing. And even though Bram Stoker's Dracula is in public domain, Bram Stoker himself or any published works are not in the public domain. So those are licensable things as well as his likeness. And so, we do a little bit of commerce, not a whole lot, but we do some. And we also try to promote Bram and protect people that are trying to rip him off in some way.
Glad someone's doing it.
It's worth it. He deserves it. He's been gone for a while and he created one heck of a legacy. It's up to the living to take care of the dead.
And his wife Florence had a lot of trouble with that too, didn't she?
She did. You're absolutely right, Alicia. The whole Nosferatu Scandal, which is interesting when you really look at it, because people go, "Oh, that movie was so wonderful. We're so glad that all the copies weren't destroyed." But when you look at it from an artist standpoint, she actually was the first person involved in a book-to-movie copyright infringement, and she got the British Writers Guild to back her because her husband was a member of it. And they won the court case against Prana Films, but Prana went bankrupt during the 2.5 years of the lawsuit.
So there's nothing for her to win out.
Nothing to win. And the court just said, we'll destroy all copies of the movie. And as historians say, just like other things from Germany that mysteriously disappeared, it showed up in Argentina years later and then made its way to America. And so now we do have a copy of Nosferatu, which has since been recovered and fixed up and played. And it is a good movie. And Florence Stoker ended up doing just fine with the dramatic rights, the movie rights. So really no harm, no foul. But she did help set a precedent for artists, for everybody when it comes to, copyright ripoffs.
Yeah, because she was the first one to do that. Now anyone else can take that precedent.
Correct.
Stand up for their work.
Yeah.
And we have Dracula to thank for that.
And we do, in a sense, the sort of the undead has come to protect the dead, the living, excuse me.
And this one, Dracul, is a prequel to Dracula. Is this an officially sanctioned the prequel, or is this not as serious as this book?
Well, it's serious, but by the time we got around to writing this, my cousins were kind of saying, well, maybe we've had enough of that. It is a bloody good prequel, but we're not going to be sanctioning any more books.
Oh, I see.
So I think personally, and this has won more awards, Dracul has than Dracula the Undead. It's a book written in the same style Bram Stoker wrote his story, the epistolary style, and it's got Bram in as a character, as the Undead does as well. But it's really the story of Bram's life, and somebody needed to tell it other than the biographers. Even though the biographers take tremendous liberties themselves, they call them biographies. JD and I took all the interesting things in Bram's life and mixed it and wove it into a fiction to the point where we claim Bram Stoker wrote Dracula as a warning to the world that vampires are real. And it's all here in this book.
Because in one of the original prefaces of his book, he claimed it was a true story, where he said, what you're about to read is a true story.
Yeah. That was the Icelandic, which I know you're well aware of.
Oh, yeah, I have that
You've got that down there. That's an interesting story. That was discovered by Hans de Roos. I actually wrote the foreword to this, and my good friend John Browning wrote the afterword. This is a really interesting sort of story, in that we believe that Bram wrote another version of Dracula, a rougher version, more sexual, more violence, and a preface that was incredibly realistic. And for whatever reason, it didn't get the attention of Bram's British publisher. And so he decided to make some money out of it anyway and send it to Sweden. And then from Sweden, it made its way to Iceland. Hans de Roos, in 2015, I believe, found that just by doing a basic rudimentary Google Translate of some of the passages in this, that it was in fact a different story. And it's been sitting in Iceland since 1901. And nobody knew it was different except for Richard Dalby, a British researcher who in 1989 found that the preface was different. And that's what caught my attention originally for Dracul. And it was so convincing that the story Dracula Bram was telling us is real. The people are based on real people, and it's real. The preface that we read in the Archibald Constable edition that came out in 1897 is much shorter and very sort of basic, and it hints towards the story being real, but nothing as convincing as this preface.
So when he writes a preface like that, you think it was sort of an artistic gimmick, or do you think he had any kind of belief in anything like that?
Yes and yes.
Really?
No, really.
Because I'm like, perfect artistic gimmick, like that movie Fargo. It's a true story when it's absolutely not. But
no,
do you think there's more to it than that?
I do. I honestly think, and I mean, we could talk for this for hours, but I get asked this question a lot. Do you believe in vampires? Did Bram believe? I honestly believe that he had feelings and beliefs about spiritualism, about the paranormal.
It was popular back then, all the occult stuff.
It was, but he also suffered through a horrible illness himself, and heard stories from his mother about Irish folklore and mythology, but also real stories about premature burial while he was a sickly little child himself, close to death. But then he did an awful lot of research in the London Library, in the British Museum Library, in the Whitby Library, and he found accounts, not just by wackos, but by priests from the church, doctors, that were pointing at people that really believed in vampirism. And so there's plenty of treatises you can find from the 1700s that Bram looked at that made him believe that many people believed in vampires. And on top of that, in his Dracula notes in the Rosenbach Museum, he also found an article from the 1896 newspaper, the New York World, that people in New England believed in the vampire scare.
They had a big vampire scare up there.
It was tuberculosis, but these people had old memories from their relatives from the old country, and they put two and two together, obviously somewhat incorrectly, but that's what they believed. And so Bram really jumped on popular opinion that was fed to him in the libraries.
Well, he probably thought, hey, this would make a great story, and he was a storyteller.
Exactly. And he then goes one step further, as you say, and just kind of tweaks it and say, this is real, based on real things. So he was a master storyteller, and it came out in Dracula. And that's what JD and I sort of used as our, authors do this what if moment. Mm-hmm. What if it really was real? And if Bram Stoker is telling us that it's real, let's drink that Kool-Aid or drink that blood and go with it. And so when I looked at the things in his life that happened, and having been an athletic coach myself, and I've seen all kinds of weird things like human growth hormone and steroids, because I did coach at the Olympic level. If Bram recovered from a childhood illness and being an invalid to becoming a champion athlete at Trinity College, and there was no human growth hormone and steroids, how did he do it? Could there have been a vampiric intervention? And that's what we're getting at.
That's the premise in this book, right?
That's the premise. Absolutely.
So Bram Stoker in this book has vampiric intervention, and it heals him. I don't want to spoil it for you, but...
No, you got to read it, but it does have, it has some interesting elements that are true, and that we've woven that fabric into the story and introduced some real stories that Bram heard about. The Derg Du is a real Irish mythology that we know Bram was exposed to, as was the Derg Du
in Irish mythology a vampire, or did you just make that connection because it was vampiric?
It is a form of vampire. Let's put it that way. Not all vampires in every country's mythology are the sort of the standard ones we believe.
That Eastern European style.
Right. And even some of those, Alicia, the more I've dug into them, the spirits are restless. They're not at peace for whatever reason, an improper mourning ritual, or they did something horrible during their life, and their spirit will come out and maybe bother people, or might not come back and drink their blood and create an army of vampires like literature and movies have conveyed them to. But they're definitely restless, mischiefy type creatures.
And if they're taking something from those people, their energy or even their peace of mind, it is vampiric in that sense.
It is in a sense.
Their life force is coming
Right.
because it is affecting their life.
So the Irish vampires that were in their folklore, that's the type of thing that I believe accumulated in Bram through these stories through many years in different forms, but the concept was the same. And then when he started doing the research in the London Library, British Library, Whitby Library, it all sort of gelled together. And on top of that, as you well know, Carmilla was written before for Dracula, and the Vampire by Polidori, and Varney was. So there was also vampiric plays that were out. So Bram didn't invent this thing. He took existing ideas and he molded it together to create the Count Dracula based on Vlad the Impaler, and put these human-like qualities to his devil-like creature, and made a story that was remarkably real.
Do you think the realisticness of it is what made his vampire take off so much more than anyone else's? Or is there some other reason?
No, I think you've hit the nail on the head. There's many ways to read Dracula. Just an all-out horror story, or number of ways scholars like to look and analyze the book. And one of them is what was going on at the time, and why would Bram Stoker have touched on those sensitivities? First of all, he was a very sensitive guy, and when I did edit with Elizabeth Miller his Lost Journal, I found that Bram was very aware of everything going on around him. Now, as a theater manager, you would have to do the same thing, because him and Irving actually adjusted plays, set design to make them interesting for the people that they were trying to lure into the Lyceum Theater. Well, he did the same thing with his writing. So the sensitivities that were sort of happening in London, they were very nervous about Eastern Europeans coming into and immigrate into their country. That was not a comfortable feeling. There was all kinds of hang-ups about the modern woman. What were women allowed to do? What were their capabilities? And as you see, Mina becomes a very useful and smart person that basically figures out all the problems for the band of heroes. So he took sort of the idea of the vampire, he gelled it really together with the worries of the people at the time, and had this creature from an other world come into their comfortable London and come into Whitby, real place. Came in the Demeter, which was a shipwreck of the Dimitri, real shipwreck. Pure Fleet, where the asylum was, London Zoo, all these places that were real, identifiable places where, families would go and visit, Highgate Cemetery, all these places that you would go, and you look around your shoulder when the lights would go down, when it would be dark, when it would be misty. And remember, this is just on the heels of Jack the Ripper. So Bram really touched the nerve by making it seem very realistic.
So that explains why it was popular then. It's still so popular and not seems realistic to us at all now. Now it's very tropey, very cliche, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting that it's stuck around so well and so popularly. Do you have an idea why that might be?
If I had a crystal ball, and get into the head of all the people in the last 15 years that I've met that say, oh, your great-granduncle's book meant so much to me, or it still means so much to me. I read it once a year, in October, just to get the feel. And I always pick up something different. Mm-hmm. And it is a complex story. It's I look at it as sort of like an onion, that if you look at the outside, it's still a good story. You peel back a little bit more, and you get deeper into it. And I'm actually working on an annotated Dracula with Robert 18 Bissang right now. And I'm not exaggerating. We're at over 1,000 footnotes, and we're not done yet.
Excellent. I want all the footnotes, please.
But there's so many things that either consciously or unconsciously that Bram Stoker inserted into the story. And each of those things, opens up the book and gives it a little more value when you start like, why did he write that? Why did he use these people to take the boxes of dirt from Whitby to Piccadilly? Why did he choose this particular address? There are so many, again, realistic things that he inserted that it just gives you pause to sort of really think about it. So it's not straightforward, and there is a tremendous depth to the story, and also the characters. You get to know them, but at a very basic level. But we really don't know where Mina and Lucy, besides being schoolmates together, where they actually came from. She's an orphan, but how that happened. Holmwood and Morris, went off these adventures around the world. But how did that really happen? How did Seward actually end up with this asylum? So I believe it leaves enough things dangling that makes you want to wonder more and more. How did Van Helsing become a professor, a lawyer, and a doctor?
Especially if he was based on Vanbury, right? Who was not those things.
No, that's right. But again, I believe what Bram did to a lot of characters was, imagine this. He was a painter. He was actually a founding member of the Dublin Painting and Sketching Club. Imagine he looked at each character as sort of a canvas. And he took layers from different existing people. Took Vanbury. And then he added a little Thornley Stoker, Bram's eldest brother, who was a famous doctor. But he was also very interested in antiques and folklore. So he added a little dose of that, a little coloration of that, added something else. So now you have a very well-rounded Abraham Van Helsing, with Abraham, Bram's first name, also his dad's first name. So it just gives you that pause. And if you look at every different character that way, they are very deep and somewhat mysterious. And maybe because there was, limited amount of pages Bram could devote to the backstories.
Of course.
It didn't happen.
And that's a great author talent, to put just what's needed and not a drop more, and let the readers fill that in. That's how you make a lasting impression.
Or let relatives or somebody else write prequels and sequels.
So speaking of you, not Bram for a change, what do you like about vampires themselves? Either what they represent or just as a type of monster? How do they appeal to you?
The whole concept to me, which is alluring, is the whole idea of life after death. That whole immortality gig.
Mm-hmm.
I hate to say it, but it would be sort of cool. If, without thinking too deeply about how lonely you'd get with everybody else dying around you and what you'd see. But yeah, that's kind of interesting. But there's also, I'll admit, I'm a red-blooded male. The whole sensuality of the whole thing is kind of cool. That this, back in the day, this was as R-rated as it gets. Mm-hmm. And, that the power and the sort of the debonair Count Dracula, but, the females that have since, risen beyond the victim, there's also some sensuality there as well. So that's a desirable thing, in the whole vampire gig. You've got some female vampires. We created Elizabeth Bathory in Dracula the Undead, who was a absolute brutal, evil, kick-ass historical person that I wouldn't want to meet her in a dark corner, but I'd rather be on her side or behind her when she goes to battle. And then in Dracul, the Ellen Crone character is a very complex person who is on one hand protecting Bram Stoker, but also warding off Dracula. And then you find out more about her, and she's a little bit more sympathetic, but she's also pretty brutal. So to me, the complexity of vampires, it's an attraction to me.
You were talking to me earlier about the difference of the way Dracula himself was written in these two books. Can you talk about why you made him different in each book and what that means?
Dracula the Undead was my first attempt with Ian Holt, his first novel as well. He was a real movie guy, and I also, at that time, I really enjoyed the 1992 Coppola Stoker movie, even though it's not Bram Stoker's Dracula. It's Jim Hart, the writer, and Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, but it's a good movie. If you can relax and say, well, it's not an accurate depiction of the book, it's not faithful, there are other faithful adaptations of Dracula. We wanted to do something that gave the readers a vampire that had recently been very popular, and that was Gary Oldman in the 92 movie. So we decided to take a risk and continue Bram's story, but using a more modern version of Dracula. And the Dracula was, in this book, as in other places, Vlad the Impaler, who became a vampire, as opposed to what Bram Stoker did. he chose the name from Vlad the Impaler and attached him to his own vampire. So we actually made that character
The same as they did in the movie.
the same as they did in the movie. And Dracul was different.
Yeah, in Dracul, in the afterword, it specifically says not possibly Vlad the Impaler.
Right.
But you wrote that afterward before you discovered what you discovered more recently, right?
Yes. I'm glad you brought that up because the London Library made an incredible discovery just about a year and a half ago. And it was by chance that Philip Spedding was wandering through the aisles on a quest. He was a Dracula fan, and he actually had a copy of Miller and Bassang's Notes for Dracula. And luckily, Bram was a good student, and he listed at the end of his notes, his 125 pages of notes, all of his resources.
Oh, thank you.
Yes. And Philip thought, I wonder if they're here, because Philip knew Bram had been a member of the London Library. And so he took this list and he wandered through the aisles and he started finding them on the shelves. And he ended up with 28 books. And he brought them back to his office and he started leafing through them. And he found these very strange notes in the margins, pencil notes, little squiggles and NB for note bene and a couple of pages turned down. And then he started cross-referencing those pages, what he found, with the notes and then the novel Dracula. And he came to the conclusion that it had to be Bram Stoker that made those little notes. So he contacted Robert Bassang and he contacted me, knowing we were doing our annotated Dracula. And he said, hey guys, I got to send you some photos. Would you help me? And I was able to, and so was Robert, because Robert and Miller deciphered the Dracula notes. He knows Bram's handwriting very well. And I know Bram's handwriting because I actually had the copy of Dracula loaned to me by my cousins that Bram actually used to edit it out 30,000 words to make the first abridged edition of Dracula. So I've got a first edition of Dracula with all these pencil marks, very similar to what he was doing in his London Library books.
Exciting.
And one of the books, Alicia, that was in the London Library was a book by James Samuelson called Romania Past and Present. And up until that point, because Miller and Bassang had noticed in the notes that Bram referenced the William Wilkinson book as his source of information for the name Dracula.
It was like Dracula equals devil. Or...
Yeah, it in the Wallachian language means dragon or devil, and cruel action or cunning. So it describes, but it's a short paragraph. But in the Samuelson book, it also mentions devil, but it goes into much more detail about this guy was known as an impaler. He hammered the turbans onto these visiting envoys. He was a real atrocious person. So
specifically that Dracula, not one of the other several Draculas.
Exactly. This particular Vlad the Impaler Dracula. So it's zeroed in on the same guy that's mentioned in the Wilkinson book. Both of them mention the devil, but it gives more information. And when I took that information and started cross-referencing to what did Bram actually have anyone in the novel Dracula say about Count Dracula? And in a couple of passages, Van Helsing says, oh, my friend Arminius Vanbury, says he must have been this guy who led his troops against the Turks, goes across the river in Turkey land. That stuff, to me, is very obvious out of the Samuelson book.
So do you think now that you read this, that Bram Stoker really wanted Dracula to have been Vlad III, who became a vampire somehow? Or do you think he was just inspired by Vlad III?
I'd still stick with inspired by.
Okay.
But I'll go one step further, because I believe he was looking for a devil incarnate. And I'll tell you why. Because more research in the London Library has pointed me, again, following in the footsteps of Hans de Roos, to where the fictional Castle Dracula is, based on information in some of those books in the London Library about the type of place that the devil would hang out.
Oh.
And it's essentially volcanoes. Back in the day, the common belief was the volcanoes were portals to hell. the sulfurous deadly gases were fumes that the devil would send out to basically to kill. So the devil's hangout was deep in the bowels of the earth via the portal of the volcano. And in Bram's notes, and it's mentioned at the end of Dracul, he lists lines of longitude and latitude, as well as a couple of rivers and towns.
So those longitude and latitude in the book are from his notes?
Yeah.
Wow.
Hans de Roos, the guy that discovered the Icelandic edition, also found these. They've been sitting in there, but nobody really quite understood what they meant. But Hans had been there, and he knew about the River Sereth and the town of Fundu and Strasha. But the lines of longitude and latitude in the notes point to a location in the Saudi Arabian desert.
Really?
But when Hans inverted them, they point to Mount Israel, a volcano in the Kolomanului National Park.
So they were just backwards.
They were backwards. I believe, Alicia, they were backwards for Bram's deception. He was protecting the location so nobody could go and find either a castle or a non-castle and say, this Stoker book is full of, there's no castle here, there's no vampire here. So he inverted them for protection. I've been there. I actually went on one of my trips. My son and I went. We hired a guide and a couple of friends, and we went up this thing, and we took some cool pictures. Last September, I actually went back with the blessing of the administration from the Kolomanului National Park and a couple of friends of mine in Romania with a plaque. And we put it on a rock face saying, this is the location of Bram Stoker's fictional castle, Dracula. Enter freely, that sort of thing. So we've got a nice plaque commemorating it, and also in I think a good way, helping the tourist, find what we've all been sort of looking for.
Yeah.
We know Bram looked at pictures of Bran Castle because they were in two of the books, again in the London Library. But Brasov, where Bran Castle is nowhere near. It's 400 miles south of the Borgo Pass. But everything else in the novel, Bram was very meticulous.
So he just said, what if this castle was there?
Yeah. Remember I said that's what he did with his characters.
Would make a good story.
He did the same thing with his castle. He took the exterior of Bran Castle, put it up on top of this mountain, this volcano, but he took the interior from a castle in Cruden Bay, Scotland, where he actually wrote Dracula. This is his summer retreat, this wonderful little town, northern Scotland. He could relax. He could walk on the beach. He was very inspired by folklore and stories by the Coast Guard. He actually wrote two other books there, The Water's Mow and The Mystery of the Sea. But the castle that was there, Slane's Castle, has an octagonal room in the middle of the castle, lit by a single lamp with no windows to the outdoors because it's interior. And if you read chapter 2, you'll actually see the words of Jonathan Harker arriving, and the Count picked up my bags, brought them into this octagonal room, lit by a single lamp with no windows to the outside. It's exactly as if Bram was walking into Slane's. And to make matters even more convincing to me, and I know others have sort of drank my Kool-Aid, why did Bram put it there? Because it's the home of the devil. But what's the actual evidence that he really did? The ending of Dracula, before it was edited out, actually had a volcanic eruption.
Oh.
Right after Quincy Morris stabs the Count with the knife, and Harker slits his throat, and the Count crumbles into dust with the look of peace on his face. And then the earth, this is what's edited out, the earth begins to rumble and rumble, and a massive volcano erupts. Only Bram Stoker would have been so detail-oriented that if he's planning a volcanic eruption, he's going to have the castle and the location on a volcano.
So you think when he was writing Dracula, his intent was that Dracula is a devil incarnate, not a person who became a vampire?
Absolutely. You see, that's happened since the novel. And I'm not sure exactly what movie director and screenwriter did that, because I'm not a movie buff, but I know there's people that have traced at what point do the movies actually say this is Vlad Dracula that for whatever reason became a vampire.
There was something in the 70s with the Turkish version.
Yeah, it could be that. I just don't follow it enough. But I think what Bram was looking for, and I'll play out this devil thing just a little bit longer for you because it's really quite cool to look into. Go to Gutenberg and get a copy of Dracula on your computer and do a word search of devil, and you'll see how many times it pops up. It's not just one or two times, but also, as you pointed out, Lisa, earlier, Bram might have been pulling our leg a little bit in the preface, but one of the addresses where the crates of dirt had to be shipped to in London so the Count could rest at peace, and also when he was going to be converting others, they would have places to sleep. Not many people remember this, but trust me, look this up. One of the names of the houses that he rented, he had it written on the paperwork as Count de Ville. So I think it's Bram playing with us a little bit, but he's also saying, look, it's Count Devil. This is the guy. And also, Bram had he was a religious person himself. And when I dug, and my cousins loaned me, among other things, Bram's Bible that he was given at his 11th birthday, I thought, I've hit pay dirt. I'm going to look through this thing, and there's going to be, just like the books in the London Library, lots of things underlined in marks. There was one passage underlined.
That's it.
It's follow God, resist the devil. That, for some reason, stood out to Bram at some time in his life. Resist the devil. So I think that piece of info, and then the two references that he found that were referencing Vlad as a devil. The place where he set the story was this devil's playground. It was a volcano. I think that's it. And then all the references to the devil, that this devil, he's a devil. He's acting as a devil. That's what Bram was looking for. It's basically a story, of good versus evil, and it's the devil with all of his sort of mechanisms and power, and this band of heroes who are relying upon their faith of goodness. But also, one of the other things Bram wove into this was the fact that the oldness of the devil coming into London was going to be pushed back and held at bay, not just by the faith of these good people who are a cross-section of British society, but also emerging science and technology. That there was the use of mesmerism, there was the mention of phrenology, there was all these high-tech gadgets that would essentially keep up with the speed of the supernatural. Telegrams, telegraphs, recording phonographs. So all these cool techie things, Bram was sort of putting as devices, as tools for Londoners to use in their advantage, as sort of a way to say, you know what, folks? This stuff is okay. We might need this for the future.
Science is a fight against evil.
It is. It's using science as the fight, but be careful with it. You got to be careful with it.
It seems to be making a statement against the kind of people who are fearful of science and saying, oh, science is devilish, or women using science is devilish, and showing that, no, this is a force of goodness. These can help us keep whatever causes devilish things like ignorance at bay.
Yep. No, you're absolutely right. And again, at the time, 1859, Charles Darwin publishes Origin of the Species, rocks the scientific world, rocks the religious world. So 1859, and Bram starts writing this book in 1890. Things have settled down a little bit, but it was the article in the New York World where he noticed that Charles Darwin was quoted as saying, yes, in South America, there were these vampire bats that came out of the trees that drank the blood from our cattle. What does Bram do? Almost word for word, he uses those words in Quincy Morris's mouth when Van Helsing is trying to explain to the heroes that there's a vampire about. He goes, oh yes, when I was in South America, these vampire bats came out of the trees, drank so much blood from my best mare, had to put her down. That's Darwin. So Bram is just, these little digs he puts in to sort of keep everybody aware in London society that there is, advancements of science for the good if we just embrace it properly. But you still have to have faith in goodness and stick together.
So that marriage of religion and progressive technology is the perfect combination for fighting the devil.
No, that you've summed up the whole novel right there.
So in this book, you really went with the devil incarnate route for the Dracula character.
Yeah.
I have a question about his motivations. Why does he target Ellen? He says he wants a companion. Why her, if she's so good?
Well, she's so good, but she's also so resistant, isn't she? I mean, she doesn't give in. Maybe she's the ultimate challenge for him. Maybe.
So it's that temptation of forbidden fruit.
Even Dracula can't get everything. And Ellen is, starts off as just sort of, as we know her at the beginning of the story, as just a nanny. But she's really a heck of a lot more. But Dracula can't have her the way he wants her.
So Dracula in this is the devil incarnate version, but the other vampires in this become vampires.
Well, we didn't actually mention how that devil incarnate actually became a vampire. And I just say we wanted to leave it a little bit
completely
gray.
Ambiguous, yeah.
Yeah, because
I think a lot of people will see a Dracula version and be like, how did he become Dracula? There must be a story there. And they like to write these stories and come up with these stories. Well, either he's Vlad or someone else.
You're right. There is a bit of a story, and Bram found it in Emily Gerard. And it's the School of the Dark Arts in the Sholomonts. And that's Northern Transylvania again. Emily Gerard was one of the sources. She was a Scottish lady. Bram got to know of her through his neighbor, Mark Twain, who was also an interested spiritualist. But there's got to be an origin everywhere. And we just decided not to, it's a long book. We had to edit a lot out of it anyway. We just decided not to spend time, which we can if we continue the story, which we very well may when Paramount gets around to doing the movie of this, which they bought the rights to, but we're not going to do it until they do. But you want to have something that leaves the people guessing. And just as you pointed out, we don't tell exactly how our Dracula becomes.
He was a human, and then he goes off to this school and he gets selected by the devil. But that was when he was very young, so it wasn't correct. Like he had lived a full life and then became a vampire.
Right. So. Now, getting back to your original question, what about all the other vampires in this story? And we chose to have some convert by different methods. One of the things is in Bram's original story, Dracula, there is no clear-cut way his characters became vampires. For instance, Lucy was drained of blood, and she got to the point where we think she died, and then she came back as a vampire. Mina was forced to drink some blood and have some of her blood drunk, but did she ever actually, how many drainings did she have? So that was somewhat ambiguous. And we decided to stick with that same kind of sequence or that reputation that Bram started by not making it really clear cut. Nowadays, many different authors are very clear cut, and that's fine. If they want to do that, I think that's okay. This is my rules. I'm sticking to this. Vampires can only be converted if they do this, this, and this. Now we've got some, without going to great spoilers, that have been converted to protect them, have been converted as a result of their bodies being torn apart and being brought back together.
Suicides turn into vampires.
And so we decided to sort of not go too deep into the actual reasons, just sort of realize there are more than one way to become a vampire.
I think that's really interesting because there are a lot of lore ways that exist, and you can look at them and say, well, I'm picking this for my book, and in my book, those are my rules. But what you did was you looked at all those lore ways and you thought, well, what if all these ways are true? Vampires can come from all these ways, and you incorporated a bit of many of them in this book. Yeah,
I'm glad you pointed that out, because there are also not just one type of vampire. There was one article that Bram was quoted in the British Weekly by Jane Stoddard, and she said, "Where did you get where did you find all these vampires?" And he said, and he listed off 13 countries. And when I started digging into those countries, almost everyone had a different form of vampiric creature. So Bram wouldn't have had one clear-cut method for becoming one, or actually what they could and couldn't do. He did list on 3 pages in his notes all these different traits. And those traits he introduced to the world, and some people have stuck with those traits, and other people have, gone in different directions, which is absolutely fine. Otherwise, we'd all be bored to death with it. But we wanted to sort of stick with what Bram created, which is a somewhat ambiguous sort of form of vampire. We just know they're vampiric, and chances are they are pretty cruel. But we throw some zingers and we give some conflicted ones that are not totally cruel, totally evil all the time.
One of the rules in this book is that if they drink human blood, then they're sort of irrecoverable.
Yeah.
So, but if the vampire is just subsisting on animal blood, there's a chance, like Mina, you can bring them back because they haven't crossed that line.
Which is sort of that whole idea of a higher level of being, a life form. Once you go into the human side, once you've gone human, you can't go back. That kind of deal.
So aside from Dracula, what are some of your other favorite vampire media, vampire characters, anything else you like about vampires?
Well, I mean, even though we talked earlier about Nosferatu having been a copyright infringement, Count Orlok scares the heck out of me. I mean, that rat type person is brutal.
And you see him as distinctly different from Dracula?
Well, yes and no. I mean, he's not called Dracula for one, but also he is not that different. But the Draculas that we have seen since Bram's novel have all been more physically attractive. Mm-hmm. When Raymond Huntley and Edmund Burke, and then of course Lugosi starred on stage, that changed the Draculas to becoming more sophisticated, aristocratic, debonair type guy.
Ironic.
Yeah, and Orlok is the plague. He is the rat. He is, I mean, I wouldn't want him near me because I could just think he would smell like something right out of the grave.
It goes against all of your appeal to vampires, which is sort of the sexiness.
Yeah, a little, exactly. So that's one. Barnabas Collins, a little more, obviously much more of a human, normal looking person.
Very complex vampire.
Very complex. And I just, when I was a kid, I didn't watch a lot. I didn't come home every day and sit down to Dark Shadows, but I was very aware of it and I did like it. And as sort of a daytime soap opera, it was cool to get your little fix of something that is, a little naughty. Because other than, watching Gilligan's Island or something, this was something that I could watch and get away with watching, which was sort of edgy.
When you were young, watching things like that, did your connection to Dracula ever taint or affect the way you perceive that kind of media, or was it totally separate for you? I don't know how involved you were with the Stoker estate back then. Like, what was that like?
Growing up as a Stoker, we weren't aware really of what Bram's legacy was or how people around the world were affected. I didn't really understand until I was university and read In Search of Dracula by McNally and Florescu, really what Bram's impact was on the world. So as a kid, growing up in Montreal, Canada, Halloween was the only time people would come around and kind of joke, going, "What's going to happen if we go to your house? Are you going to give us candy or drink blood?" So I did not sit back as a 12-year-old and watch Dark Shadows and go, "Oh no, Bram Stoker wouldn't have done that."
That's nice. It's sort of a pure intaking of
it was very naive.
Yeah.
And my father, it was his father who came from Ireland. He was the son of Bram's youngest brother, George. There was not a whole lot of understanding or following, within family members. Only 3 of Bram's siblings Bram and 2 others had children. So the family tree, although there were 7 kids, it wasn't like there was a whole family of cheerleaders now that have spread all over the world that were, raising the Dracula banner every Halloween. So, it was left up to our own devices to understand, really what was going on. And as I mentioned, Halloween was a time where you would remember it. And then when I was at university, I was tasked with a project, oral interpretation of literature, and I decided, well, it's time I better learn something about Bram Stoker. So I read a Harry Ludlam biography and this In Search of Dracula, and I became the one in the family that knew the most about it. And then I went off and totally forgot about it as I went into my athletic career and training for the Olympic Games and trying to graduate from college. And then fast forward to 2003 when Ian Holt called me and said, let's write a sequel together. And I pulled out all those old things and then contacted, my dad had passed away at that point, his brother, Patrick Stoker, who has since passed away. But he recognized that my wife and I were the ones in the family that were very interested in the genealogy. And he said, come up to Montreal, which we did from South Carolina. And he gave us the keys to a storage facility. And I brought my laptop, my camera, and a power source. And it was incredible, Alicia, because there was trunks of stuff. It seemed that because there weren't many offspring in the Stoker family, everything ended up, all these papers and these letters and these records of things made their way to my Uncle Patty. And that gave me access to understand and learn an awful lot. And that's really what gave me a real jump start on understanding Bram and everyone else in the family.
It's so wonderful. It's like a treasure hunt.
It was a treasure hunt. It was very cool. We actually found, some very cool letters by Hall Caine and Hamilton Dean. And it was like, wow, this is stuff that I've heard about in newspapers and in museums and in newspapers. And there's one of these right here, right now in front of me.
So any other vampire media that you've happened to be a fan of that you like?
Well, I like some of the original, really original stuff. First of all, I was a boarding school outside of Montreal, and I'll never forget, every Friday night there was a movie, and it was Fearless Vampire Hunters.
Oh, yeah.
That was the first vampire movie that I saw. I then read Salem's Lot, which scared the heck out of me. Having been to Maine in summer times, that's something fashionable for Canadians to do. And I just got this feel that, this was early Stephen King and early in my sort of literary life, let's say, that those vampires could be around any corner. And then, of course, Interview with the Vampire got my attention. I enjoyed that book. And then later on, Let the Right One In, the Swedish one. The American one is good too, but the Swedish movie, I have been to Sweden a number of times in my modern pentathlon career, and I felt that bleakness, that darkness was just portrayed perfectly. And the fact that it was a little girl who didn't age, that was really quite unique and different. 30 Days of Night, the Steve Niles comic turned into a movie, was, again, very original. I've been to Alaska a number of times because I'm an avid fly fisherman. And what a perfect place to set a vampire story where there's 30 days of night. And that, I thought that was very, very cool. So those are some of the things that caught my attention. I've watched some True Blood and Vampire Diaries, but I'm not, haven't been like glued to and don't know everything about them. But it's interesting when talented writers like Charlene Harris and others just sort of take the idea that Bram perfected. He didn't start it, but he perfected it with his Count Dracula, and just morph it into things that are equally as realistic, well thought out, and the world that they create is very believable and becomes very entertaining.
Do you think there's anything coming next for vampire media? Like based on, since Bram Stoker up through True Blood, what's next?
It's hard to say. I've got faith, though, that there are plenty of creative writers that'll take them in places where they haven't necessarily been.
Leave that to the geniuses; they'll figure it out.
Yeah, I like to think I may be able to play a role there somewhere. I'm trying to do some cool things where turning some of Bram's stories into graphic novels.
Oh yes, tell me about that, please.
Well, he had some pretty creepy short stories, but the language wasn't great, pretty verbose, and weren't necessarily all that well read. But I believe nowadays we're living in such a visual time where people love animation, they love graphics, they love shorts, and that I'm working with an Irish guy actually in Canada to adapt some of those stories to sort of the standard 22-page 4-panel type presentation where you could understand some of the creepier stuff Bram has done, but in a visual format. And if I'm lucky, a collection of those together, the next step would be to turn those into animation.
Oh, that would be so exciting.
Which would just be different, because yes, we've got Castlevania, we've got Hotel Transylvania, we've got other animated things, but to put Uncle Bram in an animated world, he's been on stage, he's been, in tons of movies and on TV screen, but let's try to do something else with him would be sort of cool.
What else are you working on?
Well, I've got a short story coming out. I like to collaborate with other writers because I'm not super confident in being able to put a really good literary finished product out. So I work with different guys that I enjoy. That will be a good 50-50 relationship. And Professor Leverett Butts from University of North Georgia and I, we ended up at a lot of conferences together, and we would brainstorm. And usually a glass of wine or something would really help the brainstorming, as you know. And I presented him with an idea. I said, what would the last week of Bram Stoker's life be like? He's done all these things, and we always talk about what sort of regrets you might have. And long story short, we've written a story that's been accepted into Weird Tales magazine coming out in October, which would be cool. All I'll say is this: it touches on regrets that he's had and secrets that he doesn't want to take to the grave, that he feels he needs to tell his son and his brother Thornley and his wife about. And they turn out to be stories that were edited out of Dracula.
Okay.
Like, how did Renfield become insane? And so other things like that. And then Lev and I were approached, actually, because he's a big Sherlock Holmes guy. We were approached to do something really different, which is, could you give us a Dracula story that has no supernatural involvement in it? And one of the things that we talked about earlier in this chat that has always interested me was, what would Quincy Morris's family have wanted to know? He dies, and he is presumably buried in Transylvania. What are the band of heroes going to tell his family? So again, without giving away spoilers, we have a story going into a Sherlock Holmes anthology coming up next year, which is Morris's father coming back to England and going to the police and saying, my son died in Transylvania and these guys were all involved, and I want to get the body back, and I know nothing about it. I need some help. And they said, well, sorry, we can't help you. It's in Transylvania, but we'll bring you to this Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. Maybe they can help.
Interesting. I can't wait to read that.
So we've gone in that direction as well.
Speaking of the end of Bram's life, at the end of Dracul, Mina shows up on his doorstep with the manuscript of her collected letters and everything that becomes Dracula. And the idea is that Bram takes this real account and turns it into Dracula, which he publishes. But then he goes off to those coordinates you mentioned, presumably to kill Dracula. Is that to imply that the end, Dracula's real end, is different than he wrote it in his manuscript?
Well, you're so right in saying Dracul ends with another chapter in Dracula being introduced as Mina delivers this manuscript of, this has happened, you've got to help me.
Was it an unfinished manuscript that didn't have Dracula's death at the end, or had she and her friends killed
You're asking
Dracula?
me to give you a spoiler to what JD and I haven't written yet. Good try.
The people want to know.
Well,
that's all right.
No, but that's exactly what we want to wrestle with, because the point is there's a 7-year period from when she shows up, 1890, until Dracula the book actually comes out.
Mm-hmm. Because it took Bram 7 years to write it in real life, right?
Exactly. So what we're trying to, we have, I'm serious about this. We have an outline, but our agent has said, don't write anything until Paramount, who have bought the rights, actually, green light the movie.
So you put this ending in as setup for another book.
What do good authors normally do? You want continued business,
I didn't
right?
know it was a series.
Well, it could be.
That's wonderful.
It would be very sad for me and JD not to get together again and continue the story. And a lot of readers said, I want to know what happened to Ellen Crone. I want to know what happens to Bram Stoker. And what about this Mina that shows up just as
because Ellen Crone gets into the situation that Dracula's guest the story is based on.
Right.
So if you've read Dracula's Guest, you know what happens.
You'll know So, and if you haven't read Dracula's Guest, highly recommend you read it.
Or let me read it to you, which I did on my channel. You can go listen to me read it to you right now.
Good for you. Do that.
And most of you have probably already heard me read it to you. So now I'm going to spoil it. So
do it. Good. Yes.
In Dracula's Guest, this character, the Countess Dollinger von Gratz, is in a tomb, and we see her get struck by lightning and scream. And it's sort of implied in Dracula's Guest that this destroys her, but I'm guessing based on what you wrote that it's just a pain thing that happens to her, that she's not destroyed.
Yeah, she's a vampire. Come on.
So even though the tomb collapses on her, she'll survive this. So that's really interesting that she has a continuing story.
There's always a possibility with vampires that the story continues, because they have, again, non-defined ultimate powers. Maybe the lightning invigorates her. Who knows?
So normally I'd ask you if you're making any appearances soon, but I know the world is on hold because we're still in a pandemic. But I know you do tours, Dracula tours in Transylvania.
Yes. It's hard to do those on Zoom, although I can show people lots of pictures. But for the past 4 years, I've been working with different travel agencies and taking people to Transylvania to do two things, really. Follow in the footsteps of Bram Stoker and Harker and all the places Bram chose to place the novel, as well as finding the fictional Castle Dracula, but also in parallel, finding the places where Vlad Dracula reigned and impaled and died and that sort of thing. And hopefully I'll be getting back to that when the pandemic lifts and we can continue going off to these cool places and eating good food and drinking good wine and seeing some cool places.
Oh, second honeymoon, please. I would love to go on a trip like that.
I love going on them when I bring writers or interested people like you and your husband, because we get to these places and we actually show some movies along the way. We actually show in certain crypts. We make arrangements with the hotels and the restaurants. Can we show this movie, Bram Stoker's Dracula, or a documentary about vampires or something while we're actually there? We read passages of Dracula when we're sitting up on, in a castle. So it's a lot of fun. Hopefully you guys can join us sometime.
Oh, what a cool trip.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming here and
welcome.
Talking to me about yourself and your ancestor and everything.
Well, thank you for your interest. You're one of the few interviewers that really does your homework and really enjoys what you're doing. And I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.